Virgin billionaire avoided women until he hired a private chef who changed everything. Some walls are built to keep people out, but the strongest ones are built to keep secrets in. Thomas Blake thought his billions could buy him safety from heartbreak, until a stubborn chef with calloused hands and a fearless heart proved that the most dangerous thing in his penthouse wasn't his fortune, but the possibility of finally feeling alive. The 42nd floor of the Meridian Tower pierced the Miami skyline like a glass dagger, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view that real estate agents called priceless, and Thomas Blake called another barrier between me and the world. At 31, he commanded a tech empire worth $2.3 billion from behind the safety of mahogany desks and encrypted video calls, his human interactions limited to board meetings and the occasional grocery delivery that he accepted through a secured vestibule. Thomas stood at his kitchen island, staring at another container of expensive takeout that tasted like cardboard and regret. The gleaming Sub-Zero refrigerator behind him contained nothing but energy drinks and protein bars, fuel for a body that had forgotten what pleasure felt like. His penthouse sprawled across 4,000 square feet of marble and emptiness, decorated by designers who'd never met him and furnished for a life he'd never learned to live. The irony wasn't lost on him. The man who'd revolutionized social connectivity through his breakthrough app, ConnectSphere, was the most isolated person in America. His platform brought together millions of people worldwide, yet Thomas hadn't had a meaningful conversation with another human being in 3 years. His phone buzzed with a text from Janet, his long-suffering assistant. "The board wants to discuss the merger in person next week. I can't keep making excuses about your scheduling conflicts." Thomas deleted the message without responding. The thought of sitting in a room full of executives pretending to care about quarterly projections while they undoubtedly whispered about his reclusiveness made his chest tight with familiar anxiety. Let them think he was eccentric. Rich men were allowed to be eccentric. The panic attack hit at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday. Thomas woke to his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird, his vision blurring as the room spun around him. The penthouse's silence, usually his refuge, became suffocating. He fumbled for his phone, his hands shaking too violently to dial 911. The last thing he remembered was the cold marble floor against his cheek and the bitter taste of defeat in his mouth. Severe malnutrition and exhaustion, Dr. Martinez explained the next morning, her clipboard thick with test results that painted an embarrassing picture of neglect. "When's the last time you ate a home-cooked meal, Mr. Blake?" Thomas couldn't remember. His mother had cooked for him until he was 12, before the parade of boyfriends began, before she started choosing men over her son, before he learned that love was just another transaction where the highest bidder won. "I'm prescribing a nutritionist and strongly recommending therapy," Dr. Martinez continued. "Your body is shutting down because you're not taking care of it. Wealth can't buy you a new heart if this one gives out." But Thomas had already stopped listening. Therapy meant talking about feelings with a stranger who'd probably leak his secrets to the tabloids within a week. Nutritionists meant meal plans and scheduled check-ins, and people who'd want to understand why a billionaire was slowly starving himself to death. That's when Janet took matters into her own hands. "I've hired you a private chef," she announced during their Thursday video call, her tone leaving no room for argument. "She starts Monday." "Absolutely not." Thomas's response was immediate and final. "No strangers in my home, you know the rules. The rules almost killed you." Janet's voice carried the exhaustion of someone who'd spent 3 years managing an impossible boss. "This woman comes highly recommended. She's discreet, professional, and frankly, she needs this job too much to cause problems." I said no. "And I'm overriding you. For once in your life, Thomas, let someone help you." The line went dead before he could argue further. 30 miles south in Coral Gables, Bella Rodriguez stood in her tiny apartment kitchen, practicing her pitch for the 3rd time that morning. The crumpled rejection letters from her last 3 potential employers lay scattered across her second-hand dining table, each one a variation of the same theme. Not the right fit for our family's needs. Translation: too opinionated, too independent, too unwilling to smile and nod, while entitled rich people treated her like furniture. "You've got this, Bella," she whispered to her reflection in the toaster, adjusting the collar of her one good interview outfit. The white chef's jacket was starched to perfection, hiding the frayed edges she'd mended with careful stitches and stubborn pride. Her phone rang, interrupting her pep talk. "Mija, you don't have to do this," came her sister Carmen's voice, crackling through the cheap speaker. "I can take out more loans for medical school." "Over my dead body." Bella's response was fierce and immediate. "I'm not letting you graduate with six-figure debt because I can't land a decent job." "But working for some reclusive billionaire, it sounds dangerous." Bella laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Trust me, Hermana, I've dealt with dangerous men before. Rich ones are just more creative about their cruelty." The memory of her ex-fiancé's betrayal still stung 3 years later. David had claimed to love her passion, her fire, her refusal to compromise her values, right up until he'd met someone with a trust fund and connections that could advance his career. She'd learned the hard way that love was a luxury she couldn't afford, and wealthy men were a species she'd never understand. But Carmen's tuition was due in 6 weeks, and Bella's catering business had crashed with the pandemic. This job, cooking for some antisocial tech mogul who probably wanted nothing more than to be left alone, might be exactly what they both needed. At exactly 9 a.m. Monday morning, Bella stood outside the Meridian Tower's private elevator, her knife roll slung over her shoulder like a warrior's weapons. The security guard who'd escorted her up had spoken in hushed tones about Mr. Blake's privacy requirements and strict protocols, painting a picture of a man more mythical than human. The elevator opened directly into the penthouse, revealing a space that looked more like a museum than a home. Everything was white, chrome and glass, beautiful, expensive, and completely devoid of personality. Bella had cooked in plenty of wealthy homes, but she'd never seen one that felt so much like a beautiful prison. "You must be the chef." The voice came from behind her, low and carefully controlled. Bella turned to find Thomas Blake standing in the doorway of what appeared to be his office, and her first thought was that photos didn't do justice to how completely he'd isolated himself from human warmth. He was tall, probably 6'2", with dark blonde hair that looked like he'd been running his hands through it, and steel blue eyes that seemed to catalogue everything while revealing nothing. His expensive casual clothes, dark jeans and a grey sweater that probably cost more than her rent, hung on a frame that was too thin, evidence of the neglect that had landed him in the hospital. But it was his posture that told the real story. He stood like a man expecting attack, his shoulders rigid with defensive tension, his hands carefully positioned at his sides, as if any sudden movement might trigger some internal alarm system. "Bella Rodriguez," she said, extending her hand with the confidence that had served her well in kitchens full of aggressive line cooks and temperamental sous chefs. "I'm here to make sure you don't end up back in the hospital." Thomas stared at her outstretched hand for a long moment, clearly debating whether to take it. When he finally did, his grip was brief and careful, as if physical contact was a foreign concept he'd rather avoid. "I suppose Janet filled you in on my dietary requirements? She said you've been living on takeout and energy drinks like a college freshman." Bella's tone was matter-of-fact, professional. "I'm here to change that." Something flickered in Thomas's eyes, surprise maybe at her directness. Most people probably handled him with kid gloves, aware of his wealth and power, but Bella had learned long ago that honesty was the only currency that mattered in a kitchen. "The rules are simple," Thomas said, his voice taking on the tone of a man accustomed to absolute control. "I don't want conversation beyond what's necessary for meal planning. I don't want questions about my personal life. I don't want a human being in your space," Bella finished quietly. "I get it. You want a ghost who can cook." The directness of her response seemed to catch him off guard. "That's accurate. Fine. I can work with that." Bella looked around the pristine kitchen, taking inventory of equipment that had probably never been used. "But I have some rules too." Thomas's eyebrows rose slightly. Clearly no one had given him rules in a long time. "I don't work in kitchens where I can't do my job properly. That means I'll need to stock this place with real food, not whatever processed garbage you've been surviving on. I don't cook meals I wouldn't eat myself, which means everything will be fresh, from scratch, and probably unlike anything you've had delivered." She met his gaze steadily, And I don't work for people who treat me like I'm invisible. Professional courtesy goes both ways. For a moment, they stared at each other across the vast space of his kitchen island. Two people who'd built walls for very different reasons, but with the same determination to keep the world at arm's length. "How long is this arrangement supposed to last?" Thomas asked finally. "Janet hired me for 3 months initially, long enough to get you back to fighting weight and establish some sustainable eating habits." Bella shrugged. "After that, you can go back to slowly killing yourself with DoorDash if that's what makes you happy." Something that might have been the ghost of a smile flickered across Thomas's face before disappearing behind his carefully neutral expression. 3 months. 3 months, Bella confirmed. "Think you can survive having another human being in your fortress that long?" "The question," Thomas said quietly, "is whether you can survive working for someone like me." As he disappeared back into his office, leaving Bella alone in the kitchen that would become her domain, neither of them realized they'd just agreed to something far more dangerous than a simple employment arrangement. Over the next 3 months, the walls they'd both built would be tested by something neither had planned for: the stubborn, terrifying, impossible possibility that two broken people might actually be able to fix each other. But first, Bella had to figure out how to feed a man who'd forgotten how to live, and Thomas had to learn that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can let into your life is exactly what you need to save it. Have you ever built walls so high that you forgot what it felt like to let someone in? Tell us in the comments about a time when someone unexpected changed your perspective on life. The first battle wasn't over trust or boundaries, it was over groceries. Thomas stood in his pristine kitchen at 7 a.m., watching Bella unpack what appeared to be half of Whole Foods onto his marble countertops. The sterile space that had echoed with emptiness for 3 years suddenly burst with color and life. Deep purple eggplants, bright red tomatoes still carrying the scent of earth, fresh herbs that filled the air with fragrances he'd forgotten existed. "What is all this?" he asked, his voice tight with the anxiety that came from having his carefully controlled environment invaded by chaos. "Food," Bella replied without looking up, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she sorted vegetables into groups. "You know, that thing people eat to stay alive? I realize it might be a foreign concept in this sterile laboratory you call a kitchen." Thomas flinched at the casual barb, but found himself oddly fascinated by her movements. She handled each ingredient with a reverence he'd never seen before, as if the simple act of preparing a meal was something sacred, rather than just another task to be completed. "I specifically told Janet no special diets or complicated arrangements," he said, backing toward the safety of his office doorway. "Just simple food." Bella finally looked up, her dark eyes holding a mix of exasperation and something that might have been pity. "When's the last time you tasted something that made you actually want to finish eating it?" The question hit closer to home than Thomas cared to admit. Food had become fuel, nothing more. A necessary evil to keep his body functioning while his mind focused on more important things. The idea that eating could be pleasurable felt as foreign as the concept of physical intimacy. "That's not the point," he said defensively. "That's exactly the point." Bella turned back to her unpacking, pulling out a loaf of bread that looked nothing like the pre-sliced cardboard he usually ordered. "You're paying me to keep you alive, Mr. Blake. The least you can do is let me do it properly." The sound of sizzling oil filled the kitchen as Bella heated a pan, the familiar rhythm of professional cooking taking over. Thomas found himself lingering in the doorway, mesmerized despite himself by the confidence in her movements. She cracked eggs with one hand while adjusting the heat with the other, her body moving in a dance he'd never seen before, but somehow found deeply soothing. "You don't have to watch," Bella said without turning around. "I know this probably violates your no human interaction policy." "I'm not watching," Thomas lied, then immediately felt foolish for the obvious falsehood. "I'm just ensuring you understand the kitchen layout." Bella's laugh was warm and genuine, the first real laughter his penthouse had heard in years. "Right. Well, for your information, this kitchen is about as user-friendly as a space shuttle. Whoever designed it has clearly never cooked a meal in their life. She was right, of course. The kitchen had been designed by the same decorator who'd done the rest of the penthouse. All style, no substance, like everything else in Thomas's carefully curated life. The smell hit him first, butter browning in the pan, herbs releasing their oils, bread toasting to golden perfection. His stomach responded with a growl so loud that Bella glanced over her shoulder with raised eyebrows. "When did you last eat?" she asked, her tone shifting from professional to concerned. "Yesterday," Thomas said automatically, then realized it might have been the day before. Time had a way of blurring together when you spent most of it hiding from the world. "Yesterday what? A protein bar? Energy drink? Please tell me it was something that once resembled actual food." Thomas's silence was answer enough. Bella shook her head, muttering something in Spanish that he was probably better off not understanding. "Sit down," she said, gesturing toward the breakfast bar with her spatula, "and don't even think about taking it to your office. The first rule of proper nutrition is eating mindfully, which means sitting still and actually tasting what you're putting in your mouth. I don't... Sit. Down." The authority in her voice brooked no argument. It was the tone of someone who'd commanded kitchens full of stubborn chefs and wouldn't be intimidated by one antisocial billionaire. Thomas found himself obeying before he'd consciously decided to move. The bar stool felt strange beneath him. He couldn't remember the last time he'd actually sat in his own kitchen, rather than just passing through it on his way to somewhere else. Bella slid a plate across the marble surface, and Thomas stared at it in confusion. What she'd created looked nothing like the simple scrambled eggs he'd been expecting. The eggs were creamy and perfectly set, folded around what appeared to be fresh herbs and cheese, accompanied by slices of avocado, arranged like flower petals, and that impossible bread, toasted and glistening with butter. "It's just an omelette," Bella said, but there was pride in her voice. "Nothing fancy." Thomas took a tentative bite, and his world shifted. The flavors exploded across his tongue with an intensity that made him gasp. The eggs were silk and sunshine, the herbs bright and earthy, the cheese rich and complex in ways he'd never imagined cheese could be. But it was more than just taste. It was warmth spreading through his chest, comfort settling in places that had been cold for so long he'd forgotten they could feel anything else. He looked up to find Bella watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Good?" she asked quietly. Thomas nodded, not trusting his voice. He took another bite, then another, each forkful revealing new layers of flavor and technique. This wasn't just food. It was art. It was love. It was everything he'd been missing without even realizing it was gone. "How?" he asked finally, his voice rougher than he'd intended. "How what? How does it taste like this? I've eaten eggs before, but they never..." "Because you've never had eggs that someone cared about making," Bella said simply. "Every ingredient in that dish was chosen specifically, prepared with attention, cooked with respect. That's the difference between eating and nourishing yourself." Thomas finished the omelette in silence, acutely aware that Bella was cleaning up around him with the same methodical precision she'd used in cooking. When he was done, she took his plate without comment, but he caught the satisfied smile that played at the corners of her mouth. "Same time tomorrow?" she asked, already knowing the answer. This was... Thomas struggled for words that wouldn't reveal too much. Adequate. Bella's laugh filled the kitchen again. High praise from the man who lives on energy drinks. I'll take it. But as she gathered her things to leave, Thomas felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Disappointment that another person was walking away. The penthouse would return to its tomb-like silence, and he would spend the next 23 hours counting down until someone brought life back into his sterile world. "Bella," he called as she reached the elevator. She turned, her hand on the button, eyebrows raised in question. "The bread," he said awkwardly. "Where did you get it?" "I made it," she replied, as if this was the most natural thing in the world. "Last night, after I finished planning this week's menu. Real bread takes time, but it's worth it." The elevator doors closed behind her, leaving Thomas alone with the revolutionary idea that someone had spent their evening thinking about what he would eat for breakfast, crafting something by hand specifically for his nourishment and pleasure. For the first time in 3 years, Thomas Blake found himself looking forward to tomorrow. But that evening, as he tried to focus on quarterly reports and merger documents, his mind kept drifting back to the way Bella's hands had moved with such confidence, the way she'd looked at him when he'd tasted real food for perhaps the first time in his adult life. It was dangerous, this glimpse of what he'd been missing. Dangerous and terrifying and absolutely impossible to ignore. Across town, Bella sat in her tiny apartment, updating her meal plans for the week. But her thoughts weren't on nutrition charts or grocery lists. They were on the moment when Thomas Blake's carefully constructed mask had slipped, when she'd seen past the defensive walls to the man underneath, who was slowly starving himself of more than just food. She'd worked for difficult clients before, demanding celebrities and entitled executives who treated their staff like appliances. But Thomas was different. His isolation wasn't born of arrogance. It was protection, a fortress built by someone who'd been hurt badly enough to choose emptiness over the risk of pain. Bella understood that kind of hurt. She'd built her own walls after David's betrayal, her own rules about keeping her distance from wealthy men who saw people like her as temporary entertainment rather than real human beings. But watching Thomas taste her food, seeing the genuine shock and pleasure in his eyes, had cracked something open inside her chest that she'd thought was permanently sealed. This was supposed to be simple. Cook for 3 months, collect her paycheck, pay Carmen's tuition, move on with her life. But as Bella fell asleep that night, she couldn't shake the feeling that nothing about Thomas Blake was going to be simple, and that might be exactly what both of them needed, whether they were ready for it or not. The catalyst had been set in motion, not with grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but with something as basic and essential as one human being caring enough to nourish another. And in a world where love often felt like a luxury neither of them could afford, they were about to discover that sometimes the most profound connections begin with the simple act of sharing a meal. By the end of the first week, Thomas had developed what he refused to acknowledge as anticipation. Each morning at exactly 7 a.m., he found himself positioned at his office window, watching for Bella's arrival in the building's reflection. When the elevator doors opened and she stepped into his penthouse with her canvas tote bags and infectious energy, something in his chest loosened that he didn't know had been tight. But it was Thursday morning that everything changed. Thomas was reviewing acquisition reports when he heard the crash, the distinct sound of glass shattering against marble, followed by a string of Spanish curses that needed no translation. He found Bella standing in a puddle of what had once been his favorite coffee mug, olive oil spreading across the floor like a small disaster. "I'm sorry," she said immediately, her usual confidence replaced by something that looked almost like panic. "I'll replace it, I'll clean it up, It's fine," Thomas said quickly, but Bella was already on her knees, trying to gather the larger pieces of ceramic with shaking hands. "Bella, stop. You'll cut yourself." She wasn't listening, muttering apologies in English and Spanish, while tears that she was clearly trying to hide dripped onto the marble. This wasn't the reaction of someone who'd simply broken a mug. This was the response of someone who'd learned to expect punishment for the smallest mistakes. "Bella." Thomas's voice was gentler than he'd known he was capable of. "Stop." She looked up at him, her dark eyes bright with unshed tears, and Thomas felt something crack open in his chest. For the first time in 3 years, someone else's pain mattered more than his own comfort. "It was your favorite mug," she whispered. "I saw you looking at it every morning. It was the only personal thing in this whole kitchen, and How did you know it was my favorite?" Thomas asked, kneeling beside her, despite every instinct that screamed at him to maintain distance. "Because it's the only one that's been used, the only one with coffee stains that won't wash out completely." Bella wiped her cheek with the back of her hand, leaving a streak of flour. "It was your mother's, wasn't it?" The observation hit him like a physical blow. The mug was indeed his mother's, a simple ceramic piece she'd made in a pottery class when he was 10, back when she still had time for hobbies that didn't involve impressing her latest boyfriend. It was ugly, lopsided, and the only thing in his penthouse that connected him to a time when love hadn't been a transaction. "How could you possibly know that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because it doesn't match anything else you own, but you keep it in the front of the cabinet where you can see it every day." Bella's voice was steady now, her professional composure returning. "And because when you hold it, your whole face changes. Just for a second, you look like someone who remembers what it felt like to be loved unconditionally." The accuracy of her observation was terrifying. Thomas stared at the broken pieces in his hands, each shard reflecting fragments of memories he'd thought he'd successfully buried. His mother at the kitchen table, helping him with homework, while something delicious simmered on the stove. His mother laughing at his terrible jokes, making him feel like the most important person in her world. Before the boyfriends, before the money changed everything, before he learned that love was always conditional, always temporary, always ending in disappointment. "I'm sorry," Bella said again, but this time it wasn't about the mug. "Don't," Thomas said sharply, then caught himself. "Don't apologize for being observant. It's not your fault I can't hide my damage as well as I thought." They cleaned up the mess together in silence, their hands occasionally brushing as they reached for the same piece of ceramic. Each accidental contact sent electricity up Thomas's arm, a reminder that human touch didn't have to be painful or manipulative. Sometimes it could just be present, warm, real. "I can't replace the mug," Bella said as they finished, "but I can share something with you." She reached into her tote bag and withdrew a small chipped teacup painted with faded roses. This was my abuela's. She brought it with her from Mexico when she was 17, carrying nothing but this cup and a recipe for mole that took 3 days to make properly. Thomas accepted the delicate cup carefully, feeling the weight of history in its fragile form. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because my grandmother used to say that the things we keep aren't valuable because they're perfect. They're valuable because they hold our stories." Bella's smile was soft and sad. "Your mug held the story of who you were before the world taught you that love was dangerous. That story doesn't disappear just because the mug is broken." The intimacy of the moment terrified Thomas. Here was this woman he'd known for a week, seeing through defenses it had taken him decades to build, offering comfort he wasn't sure he deserved. Every instinct screamed at him to retreat, to rebuild the walls, to fire her before she could dig any deeper into the ruins of his emotional life. Instead, he heard himself say, "Would you like some coffee? I think I have other mugs somewhere." Bella's smile could have powered the entire penthouse. "I'd love some, but I'm making it. Your coffee tastes like it was filtered through despair." And just like that, the moment shifted from intimate to comfortable, from dangerous to simply nice. They drank coffee together at the breakfast bar, and for 20 minutes Thomas forgot to be afraid. Bella told him about her grandmother's restaurant in Little Havana, about learning to cook on a stove that was older than both of them combined, about the way food could carry love across generations and oceans. Thomas found himself sharing memories he hadn't spoken aloud in years. His mother's terrible singing while she cooked Sunday dinner, the way she'd let him lick the spoon when she made chocolate chip cookies, the feeling of being the center of someone's universe before he learned that universes could collapse without warning. "What happened?" Bella asked gently. "To change things with your mother?" The question hung in the air like smoke, and Thomas felt the familiar walls trying to slam back into place. But something about the way Bella waited, patient, non-judgmental, simply present, made the truth feel less like a weakness and more like a gift he could choose to give. "Money," he said finally. "When I created ConnectSphere and the offers started coming in, everything changed. Suddenly I wasn't her son anymore. I was her retirement plan. And the men she brought home weren't interested in her anymore. They were interested in what I could do for them. That must have been heartbreaking." "It was educational," Thomas corrected, but his voice lacked conviction. "I learned that everyone has a price, everyone has an agenda, and the safest way to protect yourself is to never let anyone close enough to find your weak spots." "And yet," Bella said quietly, "you kept her mug." Thomas had no answer for that, because acknowledging why he'd kept it would mean admitting that despite everything, some part of him still believed in the possibility of love without conditions, and that admission felt more dangerous than any corporate takeover or business merger he'd ever navigated. That afternoon, Thomas found himself unable to concentrate on work. From his office, he could hear Bella moving around the kitchen, the sounds of chopping and sautéing, and the quiet humming that seemed to be her default soundtrack. It was the first time in 3 years that his penthouse had felt like anything other than a beautiful tomb. But when his phone rang and his mother's number appeared on the screen, the spell was broken. "Thomas, darling," came the familiar voice, warm with the artificial sweetness that had replaced genuine affection years ago. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." "What do you need, Mom?" Thomas asked, his tone automatically cooling to match the temperature in his chest. "Can't a mother call just to check on her son? Though now that you mention it, Richard and I were looking at a property in the Hamptons, and the sellers are being absolutely unreasonable about their asking price." Thomas closed his eyes, listening to his mother outline her latest financial need, while Richard, boyfriend number 7 or 8, he'd lost count, coached her in the background. It was always the same dance: false concern, casual conversation, then the inevitable request for money to solve whatever crisis or desire had prompted the call. "I'll have Janet transfer the funds," Thomas said when she finished her pitch, cutting off her effusive thanks before they could begin. The money meant nothing to him, but each transaction felt like another nail in the coffin of their relationship. "You're such a good son," his mother said, and Thomas could practically hear her relief that the performance was over. "We should have dinner soon. You never come visit anymore." Because visits meant meeting the latest boyfriend, meant watching his mother perform the role of devoted girlfriend for someone who saw dollar signs when he looked at her son. Thomas had learned to recognize the type, smooth-talking men who complimented his mother's cooking while calculating how much influence they could gain over her wealthy child. "I'll check my schedule," Thomas lied, already planning to have Janet make excuses for the next 6 months. After he hung up, Thomas sat in the silence of his office, feeling the familiar emptiness settle back into his bones. This was why he'd built the walls, why he'd chosen isolation over the constant disappointment of loving people who saw him as a resource rather than a person. But from the kitchen came the sound of Bella's laughter. She was talking to someone on the phone, probably her sister, her voice warm with genuine affection and concern. The contrast was stark and painful. Here was someone who understood what family was supposed to be, who gave love freely without calculating the return on investment. That evening, Bella prepared what she called comfort food: braised short ribs that fell apart at the touch of a fork, creamy polenta that tasted like clouds, and vegetables that had been transformed into something approaching magic. She served it in the dining room instead of the breakfast bar, lighting candles that cast dancing shadows across the marble table. "Special occasion?" Thomas asked, though he was already dreading the answer. In his experience, people only made extra effort when they wanted something. "Thursday," Bella said simply. "That's special enough." They ate in comfortable silence, the kind of quiet that felt peaceful rather than empty. Thomas found himself studying Bella's face in the candlelight, noting the small scar above her left eyebrow, the way she closed her eyes when she tasted something particularly good, the unconscious grace in her movements, even when she was just reaching for her water glass. She was beautiful, but it was more than that. She was alive in a way that made Thomas acutely aware of how much of himself he'd shut down in the name of self-protection. "Can I ask you something?" Bella said as they finished eating. Thomas tensed, preparing for the inevitable personal question that would require him to choose between honesty and safety. "What? Why did you really create ConnectSphere? The official story is about revolutionizing social interaction, but that doesn't seem like something a man who avoids human contact would be passionate about." The question was more perceptive than Thomas had expected, and far more dangerous. The real answer involved admissions he'd never made to anyone, truths about loneliness and longing that contradicted everything he'd built his life around. "Because," he said slowly, "I wanted to understand how other people made it look so easy. Connecting, trusting, loving without constantly calculating the cost. I thought maybe if I could create a platform that facilitated those connections, I could figure out the secret." "And did you figure it out?" Thomas looked across the candlelit table at this woman who'd walked into his fortress and made him remember what warmth felt like, who'd seen through his defenses with embarrassing ease and still chose to stay. The answer was both simpler and more complicated than any algorithm he'd ever written. "I'm starting to think," he said quietly, "that the secret isn't something you figure out. It's something you choose to risk." Bella's smile was soft and knowing, and Thomas realized with a mixture of terror and anticipation that his 3 months of safety were going to be far more dangerous than any relationship he'd ever avoided. The walls were cracking, and for the first time in his adult life, Thomas Blake wasn't sure he wanted to rebuild them. Have you ever met someone who saw right through the walls you built to protect yourself? Sometimes the people who scare us most are the ones we need most. What's the biggest risk you've taken for connection? Share your story in the comments below. The third week brought an unexpected complication. Thomas's father. William Blake arrived unannounced on a Tuesday morning, striding into the penthouse with the casual authority of a man who'd never met a door he couldn't open or a person he couldn't intimidate. At 65, he commanded attention through sheer force of presence, silver-haired, sharp-suited, and radiating the kind of cold intelligence that had built a pharmaceutical empire worth billions. Thomas was in his office when he heard voices in the kitchen, his father's commanding baritone mixing with Bella's carefully professional responses. Every muscle in his body tensed as he recognized the tone his father used when evaluating assets, determining their worth and potential usefulness. "So you're the chef," William was saying when Thomas reached the kitchen doorway. "I must say, Thomas looks better than he has in years. Whatever you're feeding him seems to be working." Bella stood behind the kitchen island like it was a fortress wall, her posture rigid with the tension that came from being studied by a predator. "Thank you, Mr. Blake. Your son has been very receptive to proper nutrition." "I'm sure he has." William's smile was all teeth and calculation. "Tell me, Miss Rodriguez, what exactly are your long-term plans with my son?" The question hit the room like a physical force. Thomas stepped forward, his protective instincts flaring to life before he'd consciously decided to move. "That's enough, Dad. I'm simply having a conversation with your employee," William said smoothly, but his eyes never left Bella's face. "Surely there's nothing wrong with getting to know the woman who's spending so much time in your home. She's here to cook, not to be interrogated." "Of course. Though I have to wonder..." William moved closer to Bella, his presence deliberately intimidating. "What does a private chef typically earn these days? Must be difficult, making ends meet in a city like Miami. I imagine someone with your background might see an opportunity in a situation like this." Thomas felt something dangerous rise in his chest, a protective fury he hadn't known he was capable of. "Get out." "Excuse me?" "I said, get out. Now." Thomas's voice carried a steel that surprised everyone in the room, including himself. "Whatever game you're playing, whatever point you're trying to make, you can make it somewhere else." William's eyebrows rose with genuine surprise. In 31 years, Thomas had never directly challenged his father's authority, had never chosen someone else's comfort over family loyalty. "I see," William said quietly, his calculating gaze shifting between Thomas and Bella. "How interesting. There's nothing interesting happening here except you insulting a woman who's done nothing but her job professionally and competently." "Her job?" William's tone made the word sound somehow dirty. "Yes, I'm sure that's all this is, though I have to say, Thomas, you've never been quite so passionate about defending household staff before." The implication hung in the air like poison gas. Thomas felt Bella tense beside him, saw the way her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She'd been through this before, he realized. The assumption that any connection between a wealthy man and a working-class woman had to be predatory, transactional, cheap. "You have 5 seconds to leave my home," Thomas said, his voice deadly quiet, "or I'll have security escort you out." William studied his son for a long moment, taking in the protective stance, the carefully controlled fury, the way Thomas had positioned himself slightly in front of Bella like a shield. Whatever he saw there seemed to satisfy some calculation in his cold mind. "Very well, but Thomas..." William paused at the elevator doors. "Be careful. People like her are very good at making themselves seem indispensable. It's how they survive." The silence after the elevator doors closed was deafening. Thomas stood frozen, his hands shaking with adrenaline and rage, while Bella remained motionless behind the kitchen island like a statue carved from wounded pride. "Bella," Thomas started, but she held up a hand to stop him. "Don't." Her voice was steady, but he could see the hurt in her eyes, the familiar pain of someone who'd been reduced to a stereotype one too many times. "Just don't." He had no right. He had every right. He's protecting his son from the gold-digging help. Bella's laugh was bitter and hollow. "It's not the first time I've heard it, and it won't be the last." Thomas wanted to argue, to rage against the injustice of his father's assumptions, but the defeat in Bella's posture stopped him cold. She was pulling back, rebuilding walls that had taken weeks to lower, preparing to leave before she could be hurt any further. "That's not what this is," Thomas said desperately. "What's happening between us? What's happening between us?" Bella's eyes flashed with something dangerous. "What exactly do you think is happening, Thomas? Because from where I'm standing, I'm a woman who needs this job to pay her sister's tuition, and you're a man who's so starved for human connection that you're confusing gratitude with something deeper." The words hit like physical blows, each one designed to wound and distance. Thomas recognized the defense mechanism. He'd used similar tactics himself when people got too close, when the risk of caring outweighed the safety of isolation. "That's not true," he said quietly. "Isn't it?" Bella began aggressively cleaning the already spotless kitchen, her movements sharp with contained emotion. "You've been alone so long that the first person who shows you basic human kindness feels like a revelation. But I'm not your salvation, Thomas. I'm not the magical cure for whatever damage your childhood did to you. I never said you were. You didn't have to." Bella turned to face him, tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "I can see it in the way you look at me. Like I'm some kind of miracle worker who can fix everything with homemade bread and basic human decency." Thomas felt the conversation slipping away from him, felt Bella retreating behind defenses he might never breach again. But underneath his panic was a growing anger, not at her but at the situation, at his father, at a world that had taught them both that connection was dangerous and love was a luxury they couldn't afford. "You want to know what I see when I look at you?" Thomas stepped closer, his voice low and intense. "I see someone who's so afraid of being hurt again that she's willing to destroy something good before it has a chance to disappoint her." Bella's eyes widened, his words hitting closer to home than either of them had expected. "I see someone who's convinced herself that she's not worthy of being chosen for herself instead of what she can provide," Thomas continued, his own walls crumbling as fast as hers were rebuilding. "Someone who's so used to being treated like she's disposable that she can't recognize when someone sees her as irreplaceable." "Stop," Bella whispered, but Thomas was past the point of self-preservation. "You think I'm confusing gratitude with something deeper? You're right. What I feel for you is so much deeper than gratitude that it terrifies me. You walked into my life and made me remember what it felt like to be human, what it felt like to want more than just survival." The kitchen was dead silent, except for the sound of their breathing, the space between them charged with 3 weeks of careful walls crumbling in real time. "Thomas," Bella said, her voice breaking on his name. "I'm falling in love with you," he said simply, the words hanging in the air like a confession or a condemnation. "Not because you cook for me, not because you're convenient, not because I'm lonely, though God knows I am. I'm falling in love with the way you laugh at my terrible jokes, the way you see through my defenses without making me feel weak, the way you make this tomb I live in feel like a home." Bella stared at him, tears flowing freely now. "You don't know me. Not really. You know the version of me that shows up here every day, professional and competent and carefully controlled. You don't know about the mistakes I've made, the ways I've failed, the reasons I swore off men like you in the first place. Then tell me." Thomas stepped closer, close enough to see the gold flecks in her dark eyes. "Tell me everything. Tell me why you're so afraid of letting someone care about you that you'd rather burn this down than risk being disappointed." For a moment, Thomas thought she might. He could see her wavering, caught between the safety of distance and the terrifying possibility of being truly known by another person. But then her phone rang, shrill and insistent in the charged silence. Bella glanced at the screen, and all the color drained from her face. "I have to take this," she said, her professional mask sliding back into place. "It's the hospital." Thomas watched helplessly as Bella answered the call, her face growing paler with each word. When she hung up, she was already moving toward her things, her earlier vulnerability replaced by single-minded determination. "Carmen was in an accident," she said, without looking at him. "They're taking her into surgery. I have to go." "I'll drive you," Thomas said immediately. "No." The word was sharp, final. "This is exactly what I was talking about. You wanting to fix things, to be the hero. I don't need saving, Thomas. I need to handle this myself." She was at the elevator before he could argue, her canvas tote slung over her shoulder like armor. But at the last second she turned back, and the look in her eyes was devastating in its finality. "I can't do this," she said quietly. "I can't be what you need me to be, and I can't let you be what I want you to be. It's too dangerous for both of us." The elevator doors closed on Thomas's protests, leaving him alone in a kitchen that still smelled like her cooking, but felt as empty as it had before she'd ever arrived. But this time, the emptiness wasn't familiar or safe. It was devastating, a reminder of what he'd had and lost in the space of a single conversation. Outside, Bella sat in her beat-up Honda in the parking garage, gripping the steering wheel while sobs shook her entire body. Carmen was going to be fine. A broken leg from a bicycle accident, painful but not life-threatening. But the call had been perfectly timed, giving her the excuse she needed to run before Thomas's confession could completely destroy the walls she'd spent 3 years building. Because the terrifying truth was that she was falling in love with him too. With his vulnerability disguised as strength, his generosity disguised as business arrangements, his desperate need for connection that matched her own. And that love felt like the most dangerous thing that had ever happened to her. Some risks were too big to take, some walls too important to tear down. And as Bella drove toward the hospital to sit beside her sister's bed, she tried to convince herself that walking away from Thomas Blake was self-preservation rather than the biggest mistake of her life. But the taste of his honesty still lingered on her tongue, and the memory of his steel blue eyes, filled with love and terror, followed her into the night, like a promise she was too afraid to keep. 3 days passed in devastating silence. Thomas stood at his kitchen window, staring out at the Miami skyline, while yesterday's takeout containers cluttered the marble countertop behind him. The penthouse felt like a mausoleum again, every surface gleaming with the cold perfection of a life unlived. His phone showed 14 missed calls from Janet, 6 from board members, and 3 from his mother, all of them requiring decisions, attention, the kind of corporate machinery that had once been his entire world. He ignored them all. The irony wasn't lost on him. For 3 years he'd convinced himself that isolation was safety, that emotional distance was strength. But 3 weeks with Bella had shown him the difference between existing and living, and now the silence felt like a punishment rather than protection. His laptop remained closed on his desk, quarterly reports forgotten. The Meridian merger, once the most important deal of his career, sat abandoned while he replayed every word of their last conversation, searching for the moment when everything had gone wrong. On the 4th morning, Janet appeared at his elevator doors without warning, her expression a mixture of concern and exasperation that only a long-suffering assistant could perfect. "Intervention time," she announced, striding into the penthouse with the authority of someone who'd been managing impossible men for 2 decades. "You look like death. You're not answering calls, and the board is starting to ask questions." "I'm fine," Thomas said automatically, but his voice lacked conviction. He probably looked as wrecked as he felt, unshaven, wearing the same clothes for 3 days, existing on energy drinks and the lingering memory of what real food tasted like. "Right, and I'm the Queen of England." Janet set her briefcase on the kitchen island with deliberate force. "Want to tell me what happened with Bella? Because whatever it was, it's got you in a tailspin I haven't seen since the early days after your mother's situation. The comparison hit home harder than Janet probably intended. Thomas had retreated this deeply into himself only once before, after the final, devastating realization that his mother would always choose her boyfriends over her son. That love was just another transaction in the Blake family economy. "She quit," Thomas said simply. "Bullshit." Janet's bluntness was one of her most valuable qualities. "Bella Rodriguez doesn't strike me as someone who quits anything without a fight. What did you do?" "I told her I was falling in love with her." Janet blinked, clearly recalibrating her approach. In all her years of managing Thomas's life, she'd never seen him express genuine romantic interest in anyone. His date book was perpetually empty by choice, his personal life a carefully maintained void. And that made her quit, because I'm exactly the kind of man she swore off years ago. Wealthy, emotionally unavailable, probably incapable of a normal relationship. Thomas's laugh was bitter and self-aware. She was smart to run. Was she? Janet moved to the coffee maker, beginning the ritual that had become her morning routine during crisis management. Or was she scared? What's the difference? Smart people make calculated decisions based on facts. Scared people make emotional decisions based on past trauma. Janet's tone was matter-of-fact, clinical. The question is, which one was Bella being? Thomas considered this as Janet prepared coffee, with the efficiency of someone who'd been managing other people's disasters for decades. The truth was complicated. Bella's fears weren't irrational given her history, but they also weren't entirely based on who Thomas actually was. "It doesn't matter," he said finally. "She made her choice." Did she? Or did she make a decision in the heat of the moment when your father was being his charming self? Janet handed him a mug, not his mother's broken one, but close enough to sting. Sometimes the best decisions require a little more time and a lot more information. Before Thomas could ask what she meant, Janet was pulling out her phone. "I took the liberty of doing some research on Miss Rodriguez. Did you know her ex-fiancé left her 2 weeks before their wedding for his boss's daughter, who happened to have a trust fund and family connections that could advance his career?" Thomas felt something cold settle in his stomach. "How do you know that?" "Because I'm very good at my job, and I wanted to understand what we were dealing with." Janet's expression softened slightly. "She's not running from you, Thomas. She's running from what happened to her the last time she trusted a wealthy man with her heart." The revelation recontextualized everything. Bella's walls, her defensive reactions, her immediate assumption that Thomas's feelings were somehow predatory or conditional. She wasn't rejecting him. She was protecting herself from a pain she'd already experienced once. "That doesn't change anything," Thomas said, but even he could hear the lack of conviction in his voice. "Doesn't it? Because from where I'm sitting, it changes everything." Janet leaned against the kitchen island, her posture relaxed despite the intensity of the conversation. "The question is, what are you going to do about it?" "What can I do? She made it clear she doesn't want to see me. She made it clear she's terrified of wanting to see you. There's a difference." Janet finished her coffee and gathered her things, preparing to leave him with the uncomfortable truth she'd delivered. "For what it's worth, I've seen a lot of women come and go in this city. Most of them would have been thrilled to catch the attention of Thomas Blake. The fact that Bella ran instead of calculated her odds tells me everything I need to know about her character." After Janet left, Thomas found himself pacing the empty penthouse, her words echoing in his mind. For 3 years, he'd used his father's cynicism as a shield, assuming that everyone wanted something from him. That genuine connection was impossible when wealth created such fundamental imbalances of power. But Bella had never asked for anything beyond professional respect. She'd walked away from the easiest payday of her career rather than risk emotional entanglement. If anything, she was more afraid of his money than attracted to it. That evening, Thomas made a decision that would have been unthinkable a month ago. He drove to Bella's neighborhood in East Miami, his Tesla looking absurdly out of place among the modest apartment buildings and family-owned businesses that lined the narrow streets. He found her at Abuela's Kitchen, a small restaurant tucked between a laundromat and a cell phone repair shop. Through the windows he could see her moving behind the pass, her chef's jacket stained with the evidence of a busy dinner service, her face drawn with exhaustion and something that looked like grief. Thomas sat in his car for 20 minutes, gathering courage and trying to figure out what he was going to say. How do you apologize for falling in love? How do you convince someone to take a risk on something that terrified both of you? Finally, he walked through the restaurant's front door, and the little bell above the entrance announced his arrival like a warning. The dining room was small but warm, filled with the kind of authentic atmosphere that money couldn't buy. Families shared plates of food that smelled like comfort and tradition, their laughter mixing with the sizzle of onions and the rhythm of Spanish conversation. "We're closing in 10 minutes, called a voice from behind the counter, an older woman who looked like an older version of Bella, down to the determined set of her jaw. "I'm here to see Bella," Thomas said quietly. The woman, probably Carmen, based on Bella's descriptions, studied him with the intensity of someone who'd learned to read people's intentions in their faces. "You're the billionaire." It wasn't a question, and Thomas didn't bother correcting the exaggeration of his wealth. "I'm Thomas." "She doesn't want to see you." "I know, but I need to see her." Carmen considered this for a long moment, taking in his expensive clothes, his obvious discomfort in the humble surroundings, the desperate sincerity in his expression. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy some internal calculation. "Kitchen," she said finally, jerking her head toward the back of the restaurant. "But if you make her cry again, I'll throw you out myself." Thomas found Bella at the prep station, methodically dicing vegetables with the kind of precision that suggested cooking was her meditation, her way of finding calm in chaos. She looked up when she heard his footsteps, and the careful mask she immediately put on was devastating in its practiced perfection. "We're closed," she said without meeting his eyes. "I'm not here for food." "Then you shouldn't be here at all." Bella's knife work never paused, the rhythmic chopping filling the silence between them. "I thought I made myself clear." "You did. I just wanted to make something clear too." Thomas took a careful step closer, respecting the invisible boundary she'd drawn around the prep station. "I'm not David." Bella's knife stilled against the cutting board. "What?" "Your ex-fiancé. I know what he did. And I'm not him." Thomas's voice was steady, despite the way his heart was hammering against his ribs. "I'm not interested in using you for social advancement or family connections or whatever other agenda wealthy men usually have. I'm interested in you, Bella. Just you." "You don't know what you're talking about," she said, but her voice lacked its earlier conviction. "I know that you're scared of making the same mistake twice. I know that trusting someone like me feels dangerous, because the last time you did it, you got your heart broken 2 weeks before your wedding." Thomas moved closer, close enough to see the tears she was trying to hide. "I know that running away feels safer than risking that kind of pain again." Bella finally looked up, her dark eyes bright with unshed tears. "You had me investigated." "Janet did, because she wanted to understand why the first woman I've cared about in years was running away instead of towards something good." Thomas reached across the prep station, his fingers barely brushing hers. "I don't want your connections, Bella. I don't have a career that needs advancing or a social position that needs enhancing. I have more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes, and none of it has ever made me as happy as I felt eating breakfast with you." "Thomas, I'm not asking you to trust me completely. I'm not asking you to risk everything all at once." His voice was soft, vulnerable in a way that made her chest ache. "I'm asking you to give us a chance to be something real. Something built on who we actually are instead of what we're afraid the other person wants from us." Bella stared down at their almost touching hands, tears dripping onto the cutting board. "What if it doesn't work? What if I'm too broken, or you're too scared, or we can't figure out how to love each other across all the differences between us? Then we'll figure it out together, or we'll fail together. But at least we won't spend the rest of our lives wondering what might have happened if we'd been brave enough to try." The kitchen was silent except for the distant sounds of Carmen cleaning up the dining room, giving them the privacy to work through 28 years of accumulated fears and defense mechanisms. "I don't know how to do this," Bella whispered finally. "How to trust someone who could destroy my life if he decided I wasn't worth the trouble." "I don't know either," Thomas admitted. I've never cared about anyone enough to want to learn, but I'd like to figure it out with you if you'll let me." Bella looked up at him then, really looked at him, seeing past the expensive clothes and carefully maintained distance to the man underneath, who was just as scared and hopeful as she was. "Okay," she said finally, the word barely audible. "Okay. Okay, let's try. But slowly and carefully. And if you ever make me feel like I'm just another acquisition in your portfolio, I'll fire myself," Thomas said solemnly, and despite everything, Bella laughed. It was a small sound, fragile and tentative, but it filled the kitchen with more warmth than all the expensive appliances in Thomas's penthouse. This was what love looked like in real life, not grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but two broken people choosing to be brave enough to heal together. 6 months later, Thomas Blake sold his penthouse and moved into a modest house in Coral Gables, 3 blocks from Bella's apartment and walking distance from Abuela's kitchen. He still ran his company, but from a home office that smelled like whatever Bella was experimenting with in their shared kitchen, surrounded by the comfortable chaos of a life actually being lived. Bella kept her job at the restaurant, but also started a catering company specializing in intimate dinners for couples who wanted to fall in love over food that tasted like it was made with actual care. Her first client was a tech billionaire who wanted to learn how to cook for the woman he loved, because some gestures mattered more than money. They were still learning each other, Thomas discovering that love didn't have to be a transaction, Bella learning that wealth didn't automatically make someone manipulative or cruel. They fought sometimes, over big things and small ones, but they'd also learned the difference between conflict and abandonment, and every morning they had breakfast together at their small kitchen table, sharing food and conversation, and the quiet miracle of 2 people who'd chosen each other despite every reason to stay safe and alone. Some love stories begin with grand passion. Others start with small acts of faith, a willingness to be seen, to be fed, to be cared for by someone who asks for nothing in return except the chance to love you exactly as you are. In a world that often felt transactional and cold, Thomas and Bella had found something revolutionary, a love that wasn't about what they could give each other, but about who they became when they were brave enough to let themselves be truly known. The walls were gone, replaced by windows that let in light and air, and the possibility that sometimes the greatest risk is also the greatest reward. What's the biggest leap of faith you've taken for love? Sometimes the scariest thing is not the fall, but finally finding someone worth landing for. Share your story of taking a chance on love in the comments below. Your courage might inspire someone else to take their own leap.